So today we're going to be talking about Italy before the Romans. We'll begin by talking about the nature of the evidence that we have for reconstructing the early history of Rome. So talking a little bit about what this evidence is and how reliable it is. And then we'll move on to talking about the geography of Italy and the role that this plays in the development and prospering of the Italian peninsula and Rome in particular. And then finally we'll look at the evolution of the Italian peninsula from its very earliest settlements all the way up to the emergence of a complex city-state that gives us evidence of the emergence of social stratification. So in other words, a difference in social classes, an emergence of elites alongside of the masses. So to start with, we're going to look at how we know what we think we know. In other words, what is our evidence and what role does it play in reconstructing our narrative of very early Italy and Rome itself. Primarily, we're dependent for this very early period on archaeological evidence. And this archaeological evidence takes a variety of forms. Probably the most significant amount of evidence that we have comes in the form of pottery. And very often these pots are not, or this pottery is not in the form of large intact pots necessarily, but it can take a number of different shapes. It can be anything from drinking vessels, dining ware, to very large containers for the shipment and trade of things like olive oil or grain. And what we generally have is pieces of this. And so when archaeologists will excavate, what they'll find as they dig down to the levels of these settlements is lots of what are called pottery shards. These are just pieces of pottery. Sometimes you can put enough of them together to reconstruct what the original piece of pottery looked like. Very occasionally these examples of pottery are intact, most frequently when they're found in a burial context. The other kind of evidence that we have is essentially housing. It's foundations for settlements. So we can look at what foundations looked like and reconstruct what the original house looked like. Was it a one-room house? What was it made out of? Sometimes we'll find little bits of wood that tell us that it was made out of timber, for instance. And so we can look at the foundations and see, was this a complex housing situation that housed multiple members of a family? Was it something in which really it was almost the equivalent of a tent that one person would live in maybe a military encampment, or was it something really much more elaborate like a palace? And sort of as we get to more elaborate kinds of housing, we start to talk about the development of complex cities and social structures. Another kind of evidence that we have that comes out of the archaeological side of things is tools. These tools are made of a number of different materials depending on their date. So one of the things that the tools will tell us is how people lived and what they did for a living. Did they farm? So sometimes we'll find farming implements. We'll find hunting implements. We'll find things that show us military activity. And the type of material that the tools are made out of tells us a lot about the date of the settlement. Probably the most important kind of archaeological evidence comes from a funerary context, from burials. So in fact, where archaeologists sort of will find a gold mine of information is when they go and dig up cemeteries. And they will not only find bodies, which you can carbon date the bones that are found there. You can figure out, what somebody died of. You can figure out what their diet was based on mineral deposits in the bones. So there's a lot of sophisticated types of evidence that can be gotten from bodies themselves now, thanks to technology. But inside the burials, we often find intact things like vessels, figurines, various kinds of drinking cups, dining implements, but also jewelry. And it depended on the wealth of the person being buried in their family as to what we find. But usually the richest source of evidence for this very early period is found in funerary contexts. Written texts are surprisingly unuseful for us until we're talking about Roman history really around about 500 BC. But really, when we're talking about this very, very early period from about 400 BC up through around 750 BC, we have almost no written texts of any kind. The little bits of writing that we do have generally are in Greek or in dialects of Greek, so various Italic dialects that were derived from Greek are difficult to read. We don't really know what they say in general. And often these are found in the context of inscriptions on clay, metal, or stone, and at times the inscriptions are really difficult to reconstruct. And we don't really know the context sometimes of the inscription. So if it's a dedication of a building, the building is long gone. We don't know exactly where the building was sometimes if the dedicatory inscription has been moved from its original context. So written texts are really not a very good source for talking about this early history, which we'll cover in the next several lectures. Literary texts, again, don't really become an important source for Roman history until much, much later, and this is more like about 300 BC and really more like 100 BC. And so it's not until we're getting really into the very late Republic that we have a sufficient number of written texts that survive for us in good form. So it's important to keep in mind as we're talking that most of our sources are in fact archaeological, and that the written texts that we do have, like the Livy that you're reading, were written much, much later, and were written in ways that were not as dependent on the sorts of primary evidence in the way that a modern historian might write. The other key thing to keep in mind when we're talking about the development of Italy, and particularly the emergence of Rome as both an important city and eventually the most important city in Italy, and then the capital city of a world empire, is the fact that none of this would have been possible had its geography been different. Rome and Italy are really uniquely situated to be a world power. A couple of factors that are important to highlight. First of all, the fact that the Italian peninsula is hemmed in to the north by the Alps. These are very tall mountains, very difficult to pass over, but not insurmountable. So if they were too difficult to pass over, it would have been a barrier. It would have prevented trade. It would have prevented interaction with any sorts of cultures to the north. But they weren't impossible to cross. They were just difficult to cross, and especially sort of in the very early period where technology and just support of things like horses, and eventually Hannibal will use elephants, wasn't as possible. But the Alps were protective. They protected the Italian peninsula, and especially cities that lay just on the southern side, from frequent incursions by barbarian tribes to the north, these Germanic tribes that lay to the north. Perhaps even more important than the Alps is the fact that Italy was surrounded by seas. There's no point on the Italian peninsula that's more than about 40 miles or so from a sea, from a water source. And this is pretty amazing because it means that it's able to nourish a very large population. Probably just as important as the fact that it's surrounded by seas, so the Adriatic on one side, the Mediterranean on the other, is the fact that from these seas there were navigable rivers that led inland. So settlements weren't limited to living on the coast. They could actually be established inland on these rivers. And Rome is one example of this, that is established on the banks of the Tiber River. The fact that they're navigable is incredibly important. This means that ships can sail on them. They're not too small. They're big enough to support transport. And what that meant was that when larger ships from other parts of the Mediterranean came into the harbors along the Italian coast, they could unload their goods and then transport them inland to these different cities. And likewise, any goods that are created inland could be transported to the coast and then further around the Mediterranean world. So it uniquely positioned Italy to establish trading relationships with a number of other cultures around the Mediterranean. Also important is the fact that it wasn't a barren peninsula. There were fertile coastal plains, especially on the west coast. This is important for the cultivation of crops, so that you can feed people. You cannot rely entirely, especially in the early period, on bringing in food. Eventually, Italy and Rome itself will rely extensively on the importation of food in the empire to feed a massively large population. But in the early period, it was enough just to have these fertile coastal plains. These were particularly found on the west coast, which is why that is the area where we find the earliest and most elaborate civilizations. There were natural harbors along both coasts, and this meant that, again, ships could dock and unload goods, and goods from Italy could be loaded on these ships and sent around the Mediterranean. If there weren't these natural harbors, there'd be no place for ships to actually set anchor and unload their goods. And then finally, and perhaps most important of all, is the fact that on the Italian peninsula, in the very far south, are the Straits of Messina. And you can see them marked on the map that is on the left-hand side of your slide. But this is basically a passageway that leads from the Mediterranean Sea to land to the east, and likewise from the east to the west. And so anybody that is traveling from North Africa, modern-day Tunisia, Algeria, needs to actually pass through the Straits of Messina to continue to the east, so onward to Greece and Asia Minor. And this meant then that whoever controlled the Straits of Messina really controlled trade around the Mediterranean. And so this becomes an incredibly important area that many cities are in Italy are fighting to control, and eventually Rome will do so successfully. There are three major regions in Italy that I want you to be familiar with and that I'll be talking about over the next couple of lectures. First of all, Etruria, and you can see these are marked with the lines drawn to the map on the right-hand side of your slide. The Etruria is what we would think of as modern northern Italy. It's the land region that's north of Rome. And this is the area in where the Etruscans, so you may have heard of the Etruscans as a culture, that really predates, the flourishing of the Etruscans predates the flourishing of Rome. But the Etruscans are the towns that are located to the north of Rome in Etruria. Rome itself is found in the region called Latium, and when we talk about Latium or Latial culture, that's what we're talking about, is this area sort of in the middle of the Italian peninsula. Rome is not the only city in Latium, it's a group of cities, but it very quickly establishes itself as the largest and most powerful city. And then finally, Campania, and this is the area south of Rome that is probably best represented by the Bay of Naples. So it's the area sort of down as you're getting closer to Sicily and Syracuse, down in the south.